Most people think winning an argument means proving you are right. Louder voice, better facts, crushing the other person until they submit. The Stoics understood something different, something that made them terrifying in any confrontation. They discovered that the person who controls their emotions controls the argument. Not the person with the best logic, not the person who talks the most, the person who refuses to be moved. And here is what makes this dangerous. When you become angry in an argument, modern neuroscience has shown that your brain literally sabotages itself. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic and planning, gets hijacked by your amygdala, the threat detection center. You become dumber, more impulsive, easier to manipulate. The Stoics knew this 2,000 years before brain scans existed, and they built a system to exploit it. Marcus Aurelius used these principles to rule an empire while it burned around him. Epictetus faced torture with a composure that unnerved his tormentor. Seneca looked death in the face and dictated philosophical notes while bleeding out. They never lost arguments, not because they were smarter, because they had made themselves psychologically unconquerable. Welcome to the Stoic path, where ancient wisdom becomes modern warfare and the mind becomes your ultimate weapon. Today, I'm going to show you the exact psychological techniques the Stoics used to dominate any confrontation without raising their voice. Not debate tricks, not rhetorical games. Actual mental warfare tactics that modern FBI negotiators and cognitive behavioral therapists have independently rediscovered. By the end of this video, you will understand why the Stoics were feared in arguments, not pitied, and you will have the same edge they did. To understand why these techniques work, you need to understand who created them. Stoicism was not invented by comfortable academics sitting in safe libraries. It was forged by men who had lost everything, or who knew they could at any moment. Epictetus was born a slave. His leg was broken by his master during a torture session. He had no control over his body, his labor, or his future. Yet when he gained his freedom, Roman senators sat at his feet, desperate to learn how he remained unshakable while powerful men crumbled. Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, advisor to emperors. Then he was exiled, stripped of everything, waiting for execution orders that never came. He spent years not knowing if today would be his last. He wrote his greatest works while expecting to die. Marcus Aurelius inherited an empire that was literally on fire. The Antonine Plague killed 2,000 Romans a day. Barbarians poured across the Danube. His own generals betrayed him. He never wanted the throne. He took it because duty demanded it, and he spent his reign applying Stoic principles while the world tried to break him. These were not theorists. They were survivors. And their philosophy was not about finding peace. It was about building an internal fortress that nothing could breach. When you argue with someone trained in these methods, you are not facing a debater. You are facing a psychological position that has been tested against torture, exile, plague, and death. The first weapon in the Stoic arsenal is what Epictetus called the dichotomy of control, and it changes everything about how you enter an argument. The Stoics divided all things into two categories: things within your control, which are your opinions, your judgments, your desires, your actions, and things outside your control, which are your body, your property, your reputation, and critically, other people's minds. Epictetus wrote it plainly in the Enchiridion. Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, property, reputation, command, whatever are not our own actions. Applied to arguments, this creates a profound shift. You control the quality of your reasoning and your conduct. You cannot control whether your opponent accepts your point. The Stoics used an archer as an example. Even an expert can miss when the wind changes. Your job is to aim perfectly. Whether the arrow hits is not up to you. This sounds like surrender. It is the opposite. It is liberation. When Marcus Aurelius faced the ultimate betrayal, his trusted general Avidius Cassius declaring himself emperor in 175 AD, he did not rage. He told his soldiers he hoped to capture Cassius alive. Why? Because, as he said, he would be deprived of a great prize if he could not forgive a man who had wronged him, if he could not remain a friend to one who had broken friendship. When Cassius was killed before they could meet, Marcus wept, not from relief, from losing his chance to demonstrate clemency. He had redefined victory entirely, and that made him impossible to defeat on anyone else's terms. The second weapon is understanding what anger actually does to your opponent's brain and keeping your own brain intact. Daniel Goleman, the psychologist who popularized emotional intelligence, coined a term for what happens when someone becomes angry. He called it an amygdala hijack. Your emotional brain overwhelms your rational brain. The threat processing center fires before your prefrontal cortex can intervene. Research from Harvard demonstrates that anger makes people more impulsive, more risk-seeking, and strips away their ability to see other perspectives. Studies with executives found that anger negatively influences the quality of strategic decisions. Your blood pressure rises, your cognitive performance drops, and the magnitude of that blood pressure response predicts the magnitude of cognitive impairment. The angrier you get, the worse you think. Seneca understood this in the 1st century. He wrote that anger is a short madness. It is equally devoid of self-control, forgetful of reason, obstinately engrossed in whatever it begins, deaf to reason and advice, very like a falling rock which breaks itself to pieces upon the very thing which it crushes. Here's the edge. When you stay calm, your prefrontal cortex remains online. When your opponent becomes angry, their executive function degrades. You're now arguing with someone whose brain is literally impaired. This is not philosophy. This is neuroscience. And the Stoics weaponized it 2,000 years before we had the science to explain why it works. The third weapon is something the Stoics practiced but did not have a name for. Modern psychologists call it emotional contagion. Emotions spread through groups like viruses. Psychologist Sigal Barsade's landmark 2002 study demonstrated that one person's affect can shift an entire room's emotional climate. And critically, the person who remains stable becomes the emotional anchor that others unconsciously mirror. The mechanism works through automatic mimicry. People mirror each other's expressions without realizing it. Through facial feedback, this influences their own emotional experience. When you stay calm in the face of aggression, something interesting happens. Your opponent's anger either dissipates as they unconsciously mirror your composure, or their isolated rage appears increasingly irrational to everyone watching. Chris Voss, the FBI's former lead international kidnapping negotiator, discovered this operationally. He recommends what he calls the late-night FMDJ voice, a calm, soothing, downward inflecting tone as your default in any negotiation. It triggers mirror neurons in your counterpart's brain and initiates a neurochemical reaction that calms them down. The technique echoes Stoic principles perfectly. Voss notes that using this voice also calms yourself, creating a feedback loop of composure. You're not just protecting yourself from emotional hijacking, you're actively influencing your opponent toward the state you have chosen. The fourth weapon is the pause, the space between stimulus and response. Seneca wrote that the greatest remedy for anger is delay, not so that you may pardon the offense, but so that you may form a right judgment about it. When anger is fresh, it is mad. Give it time, and it dies. Epictetus taught the same principle. When anyone provokes you, be assured that it is your own opinion which provokes you. Try, therefore, in the first place, not to be hurried away with the appearance. If you once gain time and respite, you will more easily command yourself. This pause is now understood neurologically. It is the time required for your prefrontal cortex to override your amygdala's snap judgment. The Stoics built a practice around creating that gap. In any argument, when you feel the heat rising, that is your signal. Not to react, to pause, to let the first wave of emotion pass before you respond. Your opponent expects immediate reaction. When they do not get it, their momentum dies. And you respond from reason, not from reflex. The fifth weapon is the reframe, the ability to change what an insult means before it can land. Epictetus provided the core insight. Remember that not he who gives ill language or blow insults, but the principle which represents these things is insulting. When therefore anyone provokes you, be assured that it is your own opinion which provokes you. The event is separate from your judgment of the event. An insult is only an insult if you decide it is one. Cato the Younger demonstrated this masterfully. At the public baths, a rival politician struck him. When the fight was broken up and his attacker tried to apologize, Cato's response was devastating in its dismissiveness. I do not even remember being hit. On another occasion, when an enemy spat on him, Cato, a battle-hardened soldier who could have destroyed his attacker, simply laughed and said, I will swear to anyone, Lentulus, that people are wrong to say you cannot use your mouth. These were not acts of suppression. They were demonstrations of a psychological position so fortified that external provocations could not penetrate. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy, explicitly credited by its founders to Stoic philosophy, calls this technique cognitive restructuring. You separate the stimulus from your response to it. And in that separation, you find freedom. The sixth weapon is morning preparation, what the Stoics called premeditatio malorum. Marcus Aurelius practiced this daily. He wrote, when you wake up in the morning, tell yourself the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. This sounds pessimistic. It is the opposite. By anticipating difficulties, he reduced their emotional impact. When the difficult person appeared, when the argument started, when the insult came, it held no power of surprise. Modern stress inoculation training used by special forces operators works on the same principle. Controlled exposure to stressors builds resilience for actual encounters. The Stoics practiced this psychologically every single morning. Now look at your own life. Think about the last argument you lost. Not because you were wrong, because you got emotional. You said something you regretted. You escalated when you should have stayed steady. You let their energy infect your thinking. How much of that loss came from the actual disagreement, and how much came from your own reaction? The Stoics would tell you that you handed them the victory, not through weakness of argument, through weakness of mind. That difficult person at work who knows exactly how to provoke you? A Stoic would have anticipated their tactics before the meeting started. Marcus Aurelius did this every morning before facing the Roman Senate. The negotiation where you got angry and made a bad deal? A Stoic would have entered with complete detachment from the outcome. Seneca practiced losing everything in his mind so that losing anything in reality held no terror. The family argument that spiraled out of control? A Stoic would have recognized the emotional trigger and paused before responding. Epictetus taught his students to gain time and respite at the first sign of provocation. This is what happens when you practice these techniques. The people around you start to notice something different. You do not react. You do not spiral. You do not get knocked off balance. They cannot figure out why. It is because you have rebuilt your operating system, and arguments that used to hijack your brain now bounce off a fortress they cannot penetrate. Here is what most people never understand. Your emotional reactions are being used against you every single day. Advertisers trigger your fear, so you buy things you do not need. Politicians trigger your anger, so you vote the way they want. Competitors trigger your insecurity, so you make desperate moves. And opponents in arguments trigger your ego, so you abandon reason for emotion. The Stoics saw this 2,000 years ago, and they built a defense system. Every technique I have shown you today, the dichotomy of control, the neurological advantage of composure, emotional contagion, the strategic pause, cognitive reframing, morning preparation, these are not philosophical concepts. They are weapons. They are psychological armor that makes you uncontrollable. When you cannot be triggered, you cannot be manipulated. When you cannot be destabilized, you cannot be defeated. When you do not need to win, you cannot be threatened. This is why Marcus Aurelius could face a general's betrayal and feel only the loss of a chance to forgive. This is why Epictetus could have his leg broken and calmly say, "I told you so." This is why Seneca could dictate philosophy while bleeding to death after Nero ordered his execution. The obstacle was not in their way. It became their way. The Stoics did not practice philosophy to win debates. They practiced it to become dangerous. Dangerous to anyone who thought they could control them through provocation. Dangerous to anyone who expected them to react like everyone else. Dangerous to the chaos that destroys ordinary minds. Marcus Aurelius wrote something that has echoed through 2,000 years. If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change. For I seek the truth, by which no one was ever truly harmed. It is the person who continues in self-deception and ignorance who is harmed. The Stoic enters every argument with a structure that cannot lose. Either they persuade their opponent, which they prefer, or they learn something new and improve their own thinking, which they also prefer. The only way to truly lose would be to compromise their own character through anger or dishonesty, and that is entirely within their control to prevent. This is the psychological edge the Stoics discovered. You cannot threaten someone who has already accepted every outcome. You cannot destabilize someone who has made their character, not the result, their measure of success. You cannot win an argument against someone who genuinely does not need you to agree with them. 2,000 years later, the world is more chaotic than ever. More triggers, more manipulation, more forces trying to hijack your emotional state. But the manual is still here. The techniques still work. The path is still open. The obstacle is the way. Now you know how to walk it. If this shifted something in how you see confrontation, subscribe. The Stoics left us a complete manual for psychological dominance. I will show you how to read it.